Hey Rooftop leaders, coming at you from Moose Factory, Canada. I know we normally do our video vlogs around my fire pit, but I got a better fire pit. I got Byron's fire pit. Byron is a Canadian Ranger, and he and I have become Ranger buddies up here over just the last day. I'm going to be working with his Canadian Junior Rangers tomorrow, and we're going to be talking about leadership and teamwork and all the things that, I mean, these guys, when they do missions out here, I mean, it is no joke, life and death. It's a beautiful summer day right now, but it won't be too long before things change and it gets pretty rough here. So anyway, my purpose for being on the island is they've asked me to come and just talk about lessons that I learned in places like Afghanistan and Iraq on leadership, storytelling, communications. Not that they don't know them, it's just getting a different perspective. And so I've spent all day walking around the island with Jean-Pierre, one of the development leads here on the island, and just meeting so many amazing people. And I decided that the theme for this week's, this month we're talking about the power of narrative, and the theme this week really is closing the gap with storytelling. And it's something that when you think about your skill as a storyteller, whether you're a business leader, a veteran, a nonprofit leader, or like Byron, a Canadian Ranger who has to mentor young junior Rangers, who has to work with elders, who has to train, Canadian regular Army forces all the time. Regardless of what you do for a living, your ability to be a storyteller is one of the greatest connection tools that you have. And the better you get at it, the more effective you can be in closing the gap. And that's the theme for this week, is closing the gap through storytelling. One of the things that I've been reminded here since visiting is that this community, like a lot of other traditional communities around the world, they've spent their entire existence on these rivers, hunting and trapping on these rivers, and recently, in just a couple of decades, a lot of that has changed, and a lot has changed for the youth. A lot has changed in their world. And what happens is when that happens, you get a gap between the elders and the youth, and that way of life, their connection to the land. And for this island and any other community, including ours, that's a dangerous thing when you start to get that gap. And one of the best ways to close that gap is storytelling, is to ensure that young people have a connection to the land, have a connection to their past, and using stories to do that. That's one of the things we're going to talk about tonight.
I think that's actually the only way you could actually learn about the land, past, history, your culture, who you are, where you came from, is through stories.
Absolutely.
Especially being up here where our tradition is an oral tradition. So no more stories, no more tradition.
Absolutely. And then you don't have a sense of yourself.
Yeah.
And when you don't have a sense of yourself, it's really hard to get people to follow you, get people to connect with you. I will tell you, that's what's happened to a lot of our society, Byron, is that we have lost that connection to our past. And now everybody's purely transactional, running around 90 miles an hour in the rat race with no sense of who they are.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're trying to get back to it. And so my reminder to all of you this week is really this, is work on story to close gaps. Whether it's closing the gap with your teenager, whether it's closing the gap with your boss at work, if you're a veteran trying to go for an interview, think about story as a tool to close the trust gap, the age gap, the generation gap, socioeconomic gap, the capacity gap, the rivalries between lines of business or rivalries between tribes. Storytelling is a bridging mechanism, and the better you are at it, the more you bring people together. It's like Byron and I were just talking. He's like, when things fall apart, you have a mass casualty situation and everybody's panicked, build a fire, right? And everybody will kind of make their way in. And I've seen that myself, man. When you build a fire, even when it's not an emergency situation, people just naturally sit down and they start to connect through story.
Yeah.
So that's just your reminder this week. Use story to close those gaps, and look for gaps where and it's not always telling stories. A lot of times it's asking to hear stories. Today I haven't told a single story. I've just asked to hear, and I've learned a ton, right? And I feel like made some deeper connections with folks that live here, and I've learned some things that I can take back to the world and maybe make some people's lives a little bit better from all the cool lessons that these folks know here. Okay, so use stories to close the gap, and until next week, I'll see you on the rooftop.